I am Mare Murray. I'm at Utah State University Extension, and I'm going to be given the first half of this webinar. And then my colleague, Katie Wagner, is the horticulture professor at Salt Lake County Extension. And she's done a lot of work in small farm outreach. She has a demonstration garden and with cover crops. So she'll be covering the various species, and I will be covering some of the benefits and negatives of cover crops, the timing options, when to plant, and options for terminating the cover crop. All right, so let's make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly are cover crops? So they are a plant that is planted densely in a site and then is left to die, so that the cash crop, the one that you want to harvest, is stealing all the nutrients from that crop. So you're not putting plants in and then taking them out. You're leaving them in place so that they can contribute to the soil. Now, some caveats. I see a message in chat. I'm not seeing anything on the screen. So I do want to confirm with Brandy.
Yes, I can see you, Mare. I'll see if I can help Douglas troubleshoot.
Thank you. All right, so cover crops may not be for every farm. So if you're growing a backyard farm or small farm where every square inch is taken and you're growing your crops from spring all the way through fall, it may be difficult to incorporate cover crops into your regime. And that's okay. You would have other options to improve your soil health. So cover crops is big in terms of, people talk about in agriculture, but not everyone can actually implement them. But maybe with this presentation, you could get some ideas. So first, I want to make sure you know about the benefits of cover crops. And what most people talk about is really improving the health of the soil, okay? Because you have this organic matter that's decaying in place. So you're increasing the organic matter of the soil. And some cover crops have a deep taproot. And so it's reducing the amount of surface and subsurface compaction and allowing more water to penetrate into the soil. You have greater porosity of the soil. If the cover crop is a legume, then it's adding nitrogen to the soil. And also there's a lessened chance of some of the nutrients leaching out. So it's maintaining those nutrients in the soil. Now, living roots of plants are an amazing substrate for the beneficial organisms that occur in our soil. So bacteria and fungi often need those living roots on which to survive and thrive. So they're covering the root system, and that's called the rhizosphere. And the less disruption of the soil and those root system results in an increase of those beneficial microorganisms in the soil. And so the soil microbiome increases. So because of that increase in the microbiome, we have a decrease in the possibility of soil-borne pathogens. So say bacteria or fungi are attracted to the roots, and they may actually penetrate into the roots. And they also have some repellent properties. So as the pathogens come into contact with these organisms, they may have toxins that can kill those pathogens. And then some beneficial organisms can actually coat the entire root system. Like bacteria can cause a slime, or you can have the mycorrhizal fungi, and that helps absorb nutrients and water. So all of that together, that increase in the biological, the microbiome, results in suppression of soil-borne diseases. So what I mean by soil-borne diseases is when a pathogen occurs in the soil and causes infection through the roots. So some examples are Fusarium or Verticillium wilt, and they are pretty common in our soils. They might not always cause infection, but they occur in our soils. And plants that are growing in these healthier soils will be less affected by them. So the wilts will clog the vascular system and prevent water from flowing up and down. And Phytophthora root rot is another example. It infects the epidermis of the tissue, so not the vascular system, but it needs that saturated, compacted soil for the water sitting there to cause infection. So think about the soil that is, where the water flows much better. There's going to be less chance of infection by Phytophthora. So you have suppression of soil-borne diseases. Whoops. There's also another effect that some cover crops can have, and that's natural biofumigation properties. So that would be the case for our brassica crops. The picture at the bottom shown is forage radish. So radish, mustard would be examples of these brassica cover crops. So the leaves contain a metabolite called glucosinolates. And the glucosinolates, when it comes into contact with the soil, degrades and forms another metabolite called isothiocyanates, or ITCs. And anyway, those metabolates have similar properties to the fumigant pesticides that would be used to kill a lot of the soil-borne pathogens, nematodes, and other organisms. So that's why some people just use brassicas in some fields. And then finally, in terms of diseases, if a pathogen does not have the host on which to survive, it's not, the pathogen itself is going to die. So introducing a cover crop that is not susceptible to that pathogen will break the life cycle, and then the pathogen won't be in place anymore. So one example might be powdery mildew. Another benefit of cover crops is when they are flowering, they can attract beneficial insects. So shown here in these pictures is a lacewing on the lower left. We have lady beetles in the middle, and then on the right is parasitoid wasp. So all of these, the adult stage needs pollen, nectar in order to survive. But the predatory or the parasitoid stage needs the prey as well. And so the cover crops can then provide that those resources as well as habitat to survive as well. Okay, so there are some downsides to cover crops, or maybe not downsides, but things that might need to be overcome or thought about if you decide to introduce these plants into your farm. So one, if it's not managed properly, it can become a weed, mainly if it's allowed to go to seed. Okay, and we'll talk more about that. Some of them can host certain pests, like a legume cover crop like peas can host a pest called lygus bug. And some of them may have aphids. So that is something to keep in mind. If the cover crop is dense, there's a very dry season, then of course the soil is going to dry out. If the debris from the cover crop is not allowed to break down entirely, then it can tie up the nitrogen in the soil. And then if you go to plant your plants in that soil, that will suppress the crop growth because the nitrogen is not available from the debris to that new crop. It can be more labor intensive. more time to think about and plan your whole garden. A little bit of increased cost because you have to buy the seed, and maybe do a little bit more time with prepping the bed for planting. And then finally, depending on when the cover crop is being grown, it may require additional water sources. All right, so again, Katie's going to talk about different species of cover crops, but I wanted to talk about how they may be used in a small farm situation. So one option that's probably the easiest is to take part of your farm, plant in the spring, let it grow all season long, and then you can plant in that same site, plant your vegetables the following year. But that's where people don't have the space to do that. So there's a mix of cover crops on the left picture, and then on the right is the forage radish. And what this is a farmer, and what he does is he brings in his dairy cows, and they graze on the forage radish when it's ready to be fed upon. So that's one option. It's easy, but not necessarily practical. So the next option that is the easiest is a cover crop that's an annual and also not hardy, so it's winter killed. So the idea is that you would sow the seeds in midsummer, late summer, or early fall, depending on where you live. And you want to have enough time to get a maximum amount of growth of that crop, and then it's killed over the winter. So here's two examples on the top and the bottom. Because again, the cover crop is the most beneficial when you get the maximum amount of growth. So the crop is killed over the winter. Some examples of these could be oats, peas, the forage radish, or mustard. Okay, another option is the cover crop that grows in the fall, survives the winter, and then regrows in the spring. So here you may plant the seed a little bit later in the season, like early fall. You want to give about 4 to 8 weeks before killing frost, just to get a little start of the growth. And then the cover crop starts to regrow in this early spring. And you allow it to grow, get good biomass, and then you terminate the crop. And I'll talk about termination in a moment. So after the crop is terminated, you wait another 4 weeks, and then you plant your vegetables that you want to grow. Okay, so crimson clover, winter rye are some examples. And I would say winter rye is maybe one of those common cover crops used for folks in the northern colder states. Okay, so another option is to grow your cover crops kind of spring to summer. So with this method, you would sow your seeds in early spring and then allow that cover crop to grow till midsummer or so, and then end the cover crop. And then you can plant your vegetables that may grow well and become a cool season crop, like brassicas, maybe some onions, carrots, and let them grow through fall. So here are just some examples: your garden peas, sorghum, barley, buckwheat. The peas and the buckwheat are both flowering, so those would be great to attract beneficials. So let's look at just some examples of how this might be implemented. Let's say you have 3 beds. So I'm going to show you maybe 3 options you could use for each bed, or you could use one option and rotate it each year. You do that one option on bed 1, you do the same option on bed 2 the next year, and then on bed 3 the year after. So as I mentioned, this option I'm showing you at the top is the easiest, where you plant your cover crop in late summer, and it's an annual that dies over the winter. And then in the spring, you just plant right into that dead, decaying debris, whatever you'd like to plant for spring to late summer. It does kind of cut you off for those crops that really go later, like pumpkins. I mean, I've had tomatoes go pretty late. So you just have to make sure that you have given the cover crop you're planting enough time to grow. Again, that's going to be that maybe 8-week period of time to get that maximum biomass. So that could be one option for a bed. And then maybe you have another bed or another section of your garden, or another option for the whole garden is your cover crop that goes through the winter. So in this case, you're growing your warm season vegetables only. You don't have really time to put cool season vegetables with this regime, where you are growing your cover crop that's planted in the fall, survives the winter, and then regrows in the spring. So you're really just growing your kind of your summertime vegetables in that one area or that bed. And then finally, the third option, as I mentioned, was putting your cover crop in your bed right at early spring and letting it grow till you get the maximum biomass, ending it, and then you're planting your vegetables. So in this case, you're going to focus on vegetables that might be more cool season that grow into the fall. Again, like your carrots, your brassicas, turnips. So this whole presentation is really a broad overview. I mean, you could learn about cover crops for a whole year, taking various more detailed classes. But again, we just want to give you this broad overview. A couple of other ideas of using cover crops. So one is where maybe your whole garden bed, small farm, is planted with a cover crop in early spring. But then you'll go in and you'll till out strips of that cover crop. And in those strips, you'll plant your vegetables or whatever you would like to grow in that space. And then when the cover crop rows are at their maximum capacity, sometime in the summer, then those get tilled under. And then you have your vegetable crop that then continues to grow. So that's called strip cropping. And you would kind of rotate the area of the field in which you have planted your vegetable crops with where the cover crop has been allowed to stay. So you get this constant cover crop vegetable rotation through the field. And then finally, let's say you just you're not using all the space on your farm, and you have often some strips that, I'm not planting anything here. Well, then you can use cover crops as an intercrop, where you take that row and just plant whatever species that would fit in that space. And then again, make sure you kill it before it goes to seed. So that would be intercropping. So those are some quick overview of some ways to use the cover crops. Planting is pretty much the same as you would plant sow your vegetable seeds. You want to prep the bed good, rake the soil, remove all the other debris so that the seed can have good contact with the soil. And on the packet that you get, the instructions will say the rate at which to apply the seed. But the idea for the cover crop is you want a dense planting. So not the same as vegetables where things are nice and evenly spaced. Go ahead and sow that seed so it's pretty dense. And then, of course, cover lightly with soil, tamp it down, and irrigate. Some people will put straw down to keep that soil moist, so the seeds will have some protection as they germinate. legumes are a great cover crop option. And maybe a lot of you guys already know this, but just keep in mind that the legume seeds, which have nodules that can fix nitrogen, they need to be inoculated with a bacteria called rhizobium. And there's a lot of different species of rhizobium. But you may purchase a legume seed, and on the package, it may say pre-inoculated. So if it does, you don't have to worry about it. If it doesn't, then you do need to inoculate the seed with a rhizobium that you would purchase. And it's readily available wherever the seeds are sold. And it comes in this black powder that's mixed with peat moss. So what you do is just put your seed in a container, and the package will tell you how much to add the inoculant, shake it up, and then you want to sow it right away. And with the rhizobium inoculant, this picture on the top right shows the nodules that are fixing nitrogen. And if you ever wanted to try this, cut open a nodule, and if it's nice and pinkish red on the inside, then it's doing a great job of fixing nitrogen. If it's tan, then it's not. So this picture in the middle is just showing some pea plants that were never inoculated with the rhizobium. So they're not effective in fixing nitrogen. All right, so the last thing I wanted to cover is terminating the cover crop. And that's just the act of killing the crop to get the maximum benefits. And I've said this a few times already, the maximum benefits is the greatest biomass that that particular crop can achieve. So when to terminate or kill the crop. In general, if you want to plant, you need to kill the crop about 3 to 4 weeks prior, okay? But the ideal timing for terminating or killing a cover crop is at flowering. Once the plant starts flowering, it's not going to really put out much more vegetative growth. Earlier than that is fine, though. So really with the small garden space, you can have your own rules. I just wanted to show in this picture on the right, obviously flowering is easy to identify on the broadleaf plants in the background, but on grasses, a little more difficult. So it's when these pollen sacs form on that seed head or the flower head, that's called anthesis for cereals and grains. So that's what you would look for. That would be the timing. I found this publication online, and Brandy is going to put the link to it in chat. I just thought it was so simple and clear, providing lots of different options for terminating your crop. And I've taken some pictures from this. All right, so the easiest method, you don't have to do anything at all or worry about anything at all, is relying on the cover crop being killed over the winter. So oats in the spring on the left and radishes on the left. And then in the spring, this is what they may look like. So you just plant right into that. Another termination method that requires more labor is called crimping. Now, crimping is not for every plant, but the idea is that the plant is pushed over and then it's kind of damaged as it's pushed over, and all of that action prevents the flow of water and thus kills the plant. It only may work for grasses like cereal rye, winter rye. This picture on the lower left shows what a big operation might do for crimping, rolling over the plant with a tractor. It's called a roller crimper. So that could be effective. But in most cases, the act of crimping is really only a preparation for a second stage of termination. So crimping may not always work or be the standalone option. So for small farms, backyards, you can actually crimp, shown on the top left, just by stepping on the grasses, and you want to lay them all down in the same direction. On the lower left, some people use a 2x4 with some string, lay it down, and then use your manpower weight by flattening out the grasses. And then on the right, this farm is using a T-post with string, with a person in front pulling the T-post, and then people following by stepping on it as they go. So that's just a preparation method. The other preparation method is just mowing or weed whacking. And when you think about weed whacking, this guy's cutting some tall grasses down. You have some long pieces of debris to deal with. So some people have recommended to weed whack in layers. Go across the top of the plant, the middle of the plant, the bottom of the plant, so that you can have smaller pieces left over. All right, so I talked about winter kill, crimping as options to terminate. And so then there's tilling or shoveling under. So with both of these, you would want to weed whack or mow first so that you're not dealing with a large plant. The downside is it can break up the root system, so you want to avoid deep tillage, and also it may not kill the plant completely. And then you want to leave the debris in place, wait 2 to 4 weeks, and then you can plant your plant into that debris. Okay, so tarping would probably be like winter kill, a foolproof method of killing the cover crop. You would need to prep the bed first. So you do that by weed whacking, mowing, or crimping down. Again, all in the same direction. Lay the black plastic down on the bed. In this case, the root systems die and are left in place. So that's great. Leave the tarp on for about 2 to 3 weeks. And then there's no need to till. So remove the plastic, and then you're ready to plant in place. And then finally, some people actually they'll pin in chickens in whatever bed needs to be taken care of. May take a little bit longer, but they'll get rid of the top part, and the roots will still be left in place in the soil. Note that chickens should not be used for hairy vetch because those seeds are poisonous. So I'm finished there. What I'm going to do is make a copy of my PDF and put it into the chat so that you guys can at least have a copy of these slides. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and then let Katie Wagner take over.
Okay, thanks, Mare. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and then I'm going to ask again in just a second if you can see my slides okay. So give me just 1 second. Yeah. Let's see. Hopefully those should be popping up. Can you see that okay, Mare?
Looks perfect.
Awesome. Well,
Good.
that's the first feat. So thank you so much. We had a lot of great questions. And thanks again for having me. I've been tasked with providing some instruction on cover crop species and mixed examples, and to address attributes and issues associated with cover crop selections. So I want to make sure, especially with some of the questions that came in with Q&A, that everyone realizes that there are some extremely informative resources available online that detail implications and recommendations for utilizing cover crops and production systems. And I really leaned on a lot of these in putting together this webinar today. And I learned a lot from reviewing them. So I highly recommend for those of you with interest in this topic to further explore them, because they contain way more information and detailed information in particular that we aren't going to have time to discuss today. So I will supply those for you here in a minute. And I want to go ahead and just move to my first slide and say, before we get started, if you will please comment in the chat function if you think you know what the grass strip in this picture is called and what function it serves for this production system. Okay, so the first resources I have listed here is a YouTube video that was put together by Dr. Dan Drost, who is our recently retired vegetable production specialist. And he provided his overview of cover crop successes in Utah production systems, in particular vegetable crops, with an overarching goal to improve soil health. And so this video details his recommendations for cover crop selections based from previous research plots and site visits to Utah farms he carried out over his career. This next resource is a fact sheet that details different types and management strategies for cover crops. It has a table that includes detailed information on 7 grass cover crops, 8 legumes, and 4 broadleaf, so almost 20 different cover crop options. The third is a fact sheet that details establishment and termination factors related to cover crop selections and provides information on identification features and tolerance to site-specific factors like drought and salinity. I know we had some questions on that in the Q&A. The fourth resource outlines seasonal cover crop rotations with vegetable production cycles that were utilized at the Student Organic Farm in Cache County. And it's a really excellent publication for helping growers understand how to time integration of cover crops and vegetable production scenarios with space constraints, which is a really common challenge I hear about from a lot of our urban producers. And finally, I want to make sure everybody knows about a really excellent publication that is online through SARE, and it's called How to Manage Cover Crops Profitably. And what's nice about this publication, it's quite long, but you can pull it up online and you can download it for free. And it's going to get into a lot of detail and cover lots of different types of cover crops, different mix options, what grows well, where regionally, all those different types of information. So it's really a wonderful publication as well. Okay, I'm going to try to pull up this chat function now, and I'm just curious to see what people put as their responses to my question. Okay, we've got a lot of people, so pardon me if I'm not going to go through everything. Ooh, I've got one here. Strip could help decrease soil erosion and provide habitat for beneficial insects. Wildlife corridor, erosion, pollinators, prairie strip. Oh, a lot of really good answers there. The picture here is, in fact, of something that's called a beetle bank. And beetle banks are slightly bermed plantings of perennial grasses. They're usually native grasses that provide habitat for beneficial insects like predaceous ground beetles and spiders, and some ground nesting birds as well. And they can help to control erosion, runoff, and channel water on sloped areas. So a lot of you were spot on with your answers. So when you have production areas like this that are tilled or disturbed, these grass berms provide refuge for certain types of beneficial insects to escape, reproduce, and hunt within. They are slightly raised so water does not flood to maintain suitable nesting sites. And I one time heard an East Coast producer, I love this, that described these beetle banks as meeting places because they were places where predatory insects retreat. And because they're all retreating back to this area, they tend to bump into one another, which increased encounters and help them build their populations right next to cropping areas. So this is kind of like a real life example of speed dating here. Other types of cover crop plantings, either annual, perennial, or mixed, are things like conservation strips that incorporate flowering plants that provide quality pollen and nectar for pollinators and other types of beneficial insects, including some natural enemies like lacewings and ladybird beetles, or flowering hedgerows as well, which are a more permanent planting that provide habitat for birds, spiders, predaceous ground beetles, mantids, things like that. And as a side benefit, sometimes these types of landscape elements or farm elements also serve as windbreaks right next to cropping areas. So the idea here is, as we have these different sort of elements within the farm, that they're serving some sort of a benefit or a purpose to that particular area. All right, let me see if I can advance this. Oh, give me 1 second. I think it's because I hit chat. There we go. Okay. So just as a recap of many of the points that Mayor just covered, producers choose specific cover crop species or mixes with identified goals and benefits in mind. I really want to emphasize that cover crops are an ideal way to work in seasonal crop rotation cycle into an annual vegetable production plan. So it can be really important for small acreage producers facing space constraints, or even backyard gardeners who want to grow the same types of crops every year from year to year, but they also want to maintain good crop rotation practices. So say, for example, you have a garden quadrant that you want to grow tomatoes year 1, maybe onions year 2, and peppers year 3. Tomatoes and peppers are, of course, in the same family, so you can work in 2 additional crop rotations by planting winter cover crops in that same area. So cover crops are really a great way for diversifying plantings in constrained areas. Growers do need to think through the nuances of specific scenarios. For example, a late maturing pepper crop that a grower plans to follow with a winter cover crop selection, let's say hairy vetch, for example, might require the grower to plant the vetch prior to removing the pepper crops to ensure the vetch has enough growing days to establish prior to the start of the dormant season. So some examples of cover crops with slightly greater shade tolerance include things like rye, vetch, and clovers. But I do want to point out that some species of clovers can quickly become a problematic weed in annual cropping systems. So they might be a really good choice for a perennial system like fruit trees or things like that. But sometimes we have to have a little caution, be a little wary of them becoming a weed problem for us in other types of garden areas. If a cover crop is grown to store an excess of nutrients, for example, manure spread from a livestock operation, selection criteria might include rapid establishment and excellent nutrient mopping capabilities. Things like cereal grains and brassicas would be appropriate choices. And in general, winter cover crop seed should be sown, like Mare said, about 4 to 6 weeks prior to fall frost. Some exceptions are your winter cereal crops, and in particular, Mare mentioned rye, have a little bit better cold tolerance, and so they can be seeded a little closer to your first fall frost date. So rye is an example of a cover crop that tends to have a really long residual in the garden. So it will stick around in the system for a long time. So if you're using it as like a surface mulch, it will hang out in that system a little bit longer, somewhere in the range of about 6 to 12 weeks, compared to some other types of cover crops like vetch or field peas, which residues only really last in the system for about 4 to 8 weeks. One note about rye is it does have allelopathic properties that can inhibit seedling growth. So it should be used cautiously in rotational patterns because of that. Another consideration is fall irrigation. If you're having a particularly dry fall, you may want to, or you may need to irrigate your cover crop into establishments, so making sure you have irrigation available. In northern Utah, we usually plant a winter cover crop in early to late September, so they have time to establish themselves. And if you live in Utah and you want to know your average first fall frost, you can visit climate.usu.edu to find out that information for your location. It is also important to be mindful of species-specific attributes such as height and growth rate to avoid competition for resources. Because you, of course, want to maximize production in your cash crop. And so you want to make sure that your cover crop is not robbing your cash crop of the resources it needs to maintain maximum productivity for you. And finally, I just want to say really quick that you need to also consider your termination plans for your cover crop. For example, if you are in a growing area that has a high clay content, and you would determine this through a soil test report, then spring tilling may be of concern during wet soil conditions. Soils with high clay content produce impenetrable clay clods when tilled wet, and compaction is most severe under saturated conditions. So you may want to consider a backup termination plan in case you're dealing with really wet spring conditions in those types of scenarios. Okay. All right. So I want to look specifically at some grass cover crops. By the way, I pulled this table from Dan Dross' YouTube video on cover crops and soil fertility in case you want to see it again in the future. And we can compare and contrast different species and their attributes. So Dan identified 3 grass species, and those are the ones that you see highlighted in green, that perform well in northern Utah, which were millet, wheat, and sorghum Sudan. Millet and sorghum Sudan are summer cover crops, so they're planted mid to late June, while wheat is a winter cover crop that is established in the fall. And this table compares the potential of these species to take up and store nitrogen, or the nutrient mop column, add organic matter and improve soil structure, or the soil builder column, stabilize the soil, or the erosion fighter column, outcompete weed growth, or the weed checker column, and rate of rapidness of growth and lasting of residue, the lasting residue column. The table also identifies if the species is a summer or winter cover crop. Remember, we established winter cover crops in the fall, and they remain in the growing area through the dormant season. So just talking about these three recommended for a minute. Millet, wheat, and sorghum Sudan perform the best in Utah conditions when tested and compared with others listed. Millet grows fast in the summer and it produces moderate biomass. Sorghum Sudan grows rapidly and it thrives in hot conditions, and it is an excellent nutrient mop. Nutrient mop performers are ideally planted right after a cash crop harvest, and this is done to retain nutrients such as nitrogen within the field site. Sorghum Sudan happens to be a very tall growing cover crop, about 4 to 5 feet tall. So it's important to not grow it too close to summer cash crops so that it does not block sun exposure to those maturing plants. And sorghum Sudan has deep penetrating roots that can break up soil compaction. Wheat is a recommended winter cover crop, and you may wonder why, with all the excellent ratings on rye, that it's not recommended over wheat. But rye can be difficult to terminate, so it can become a weed problem. We also just briefly mentioned that residue from rye can suppress subsequent plant growth, so wheat is recommended over rye in many circumstances. I wanted to point out that one major advantage of grass or grain cover crops over other types we will discuss in a moment are their ability to establish quickly and their tolerance of foot traffic. USU Extension has an interesting fact sheet titled Using Winter Grains as a Cover Crop. See if I can pull that up here. You can see that at the bottom. That discusses application of winter grains as fall and late spring planted cover crops. Some winter grains, like wheat and barley, can be planted in the spring and established, and then they can be mowed almost like a turf area to provide a grassed walkway. And this particular publication recommended winter barley. By the way, this recommendation came from about 15 years of garden trials for spring plantings because it was less likely than rye to produce seed, but tolerated foot traffic better than wheat. So again, a lot of really great resources there. This is a picture of sorghum Sudan grass. It almost looks like corn. It does get quite tall. It's a very aggressive grower. And again, it really thrives in hot summer conditions. Okay, let's move on to some broadleaf cover crops. The two most recommended by Dan were buckwheat and summer radish. Buckwheat is a summer cover crop and radish for planting in the fall. Buckwheat produces a lot of dry matter and grows rapidly, so it does a great job of keeping the soil covered and outcompeting weeds. Another side benefit of buckwheat is bees and other pollinators are attracted to blooms, so buckwheat provides a food source during hot summer conditions when many other pollinator plants are not in bloom. For example, sometimes you can see buckwheat honey that's for sale. That bees are coming and they're pollinating those blooms. I might also add that it's quite beautiful plant when planted in masses, but buckwheat is a poor nutrient mop and it performs moderately in terms of soil building. Radish and other brassicas like kale produce taproots that alleviate soil compaction, keep the soil covered, grow moderate amounts of dry matter, and are moderate weed checkers to boot. And another benefit of growing kale, for example, is over something like winter wheat, is that you can plant it a little earlier to get better soil coverage earlier in the fall to outcompete some of the fall growing weeds in the garden. Okay. And this is a picture of buckwheat. I took this picture at the Salt Lake County Horticulture Program garden, and it tends to be in full bloom in kind of the hot summer months, and you can just see the excellent coverage there. So it really does a great job of outcompeting the weeds. The irrigation in this particular area is running on planting beds underneath these plants, and so there really isn't a whole lot of weed growth that's occurring underneath them. Okay, so again, some non-legume cover crop highlights. We gave you some of those examples there, and they are best at mopping nutrients, especially nitrogen from previous crop, reducing and preventing erosion, producing residue. It tends to be longer lasting than leguminous crops that we'll talk about in a minute in adding organic matter to the soil. And they also do a good job of suppressing weeds. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so let's move on to our legume selections. Two species in rose color here are perennials, and so they can become problematic and persistent weeds if you're not careful, so just a little caution on those. But legumes, as Mira mentioned, fix atmospheric nitrogen at the root zone, so they enhance soil fertility. Crops grown after legumes can take up between 30 to 60% of the nitrogen produced by the leguminous cover crop. Dan recommends hairy vetch for fall planting and various types of beans for summer planting. Beans can, of course, be a cash crop too. Hairy vetch grows rapidly. It produces good dry matter amounts and between 80 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. It grows somewhat slowly in the fall, and it doesn't really start fixing nitrogen until the following spring, as a note. It's important to terminate legumes at the appropriate stage. Early to mid blossom stage is best. My personal experience with hairy vetch is that it performs as a moderate weed checker, so some additional mechanical weed control is probably necessary in the fall when growing vetch as a cover crop. Vetch also does not mop up nutrients, as well as some other types of cover crops that have been presented in previous tables. And as Mara mentioned, and a tip I learned from Dan, is with the leguminous cover crops, it's really wise to go ahead and inoculate them, especially the first time you plant them in an area, so that you increase the potential for nitrogen fixation from them. There are some nice resources. Mayor provided those. There's a USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service called Using the Appropriate Legume Inoculant for Conservation Plantings. Also in this publication, I've been referring Managing Cover Crops Profitably. There are some inoculation recommendations as well. Beans grow relatively quickly and do a good job of covering the soil surface. Bush bean types do not grow as tall as, say, cowpeas, which have a tendency to flop over. And beans can be grown as a cover crop over a relatively short period, since they tend to have, at least with the bush beans, they tend to have a low days to harvest requirement, meaning that they can be squeezed into annual crop rotation cycles. However, cowpeas and vetch have higher nitrogen fixation rates than beans. All right, this is hairy vetch, again, growing out at the Salt Lake County Jail Horticulture Program. This is not too long after it had been seeded in the fall time. And you can see at this point in time, there's quite a bit of bare soil still exposed. And so this area is vulnerable for weed growth as these plants get established and are able to grow. Okay, so some legume cover crop highlights. I gave you some examples here. They're best at fixing atmospheric nitrogen for take up by subsequent crops, reduction and prevention of erosion, producing residue, tends to be short lasting, and adding organic matter. Actually, legumes don't tend to add as much soil organic matter back to the soil as non-legumes, but they do still add to the soil. And then some of them also are really good at attracting beneficial insects. Okay, I'm almost done here, and then we'll probably open up for some questions, as I know that you have them. But I want to end with some cover crop mixes. So cover crop mixes or combinations can be utilized to enhance certain benefits. One example for fall planting is combining wheat and vetch, since the wheat does a good job of mopping nutrients and the vetch does an excellent job of fixing nitrogen. Summer mixes can include beans, millet, and buckwheat combinations that grow quickly and cover the soil surface rapidly to reduce potential weed growth. The key attributes are ease of establishment, rapid growth rate, and good adaptation to your garden or field site. Fall planted cover crops like vetch, wheat, and kale keep the soil covered through the dormant season and reduce weed germination the following spring. Cover crops should be terminated about 2 to 3 weeks prior to planting desirable production crops. So keeping the soil covered, cover crops can really provide effective weed control if well strategized and implemented. And so again, these are some of the highlights or some of the benefits that we get from mixing or combining different types of cover crops. Sometimes winter survival, they're called nurse crops. So for example, your cereal grains have a little bit better cold tolerance than legumes. And so by combining those two together, you can get a little bit better survivability with your legumes because those cereal grains are there, your winter grass crops. Soil coverage, biomass and nitrogen production, weed control, duration of growing periods. Some of these cover crops might grow a little longer than others, and so it can help with that as well, keeping the soil covered over a longer period of time. Attraction of beneficial insects, tolerance of adverse conditions, and response to various variable traits, soil traits. This is just a little graphic that was put together by the NRCS, and it's really quite lovely, and I like how they did a synopsis of cover crops here. An essential element of any organic farmer's crop rotation system, cover crops increase soil organic matter, keep the ground covered to slow erosion from water and wind, suppress soil diseases and pests, enhance water availability, smother weeds, and provide significant contribution to the farm's biodiversity. So we plant cover crops with specific purposes or benefits in mind, but sometimes the attribute or the benefits that they extend go well beyond just what we intended from them. So they're really a wonderful addition to any farm or garden management plan. So with that, we have some contact information for both Mare and I. And I am done, and I'm happy to open up for any questions that you may have.